Thank you, Stephanie. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you to follow the remarks of Governor Deal. And just to, I know this is what heartens me and gives me hope and makes me so excited is sort of the collective experience and expertise and commitment of everyone in this room. And certainly everyone took stock of the volumes of people here that represent our department. And I sure can think that that speaks to their commitment in understanding what our perspective is as external stakeholders in this system and how we all can come together and think about what recommendations can get us to a place of better outcomes for children and families. So I was asked to do an overview of the child welfare system. We have, I think maybe I edged out a little bit of extra time because we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but this is the big frame on this, right? So in the amount of time that we have, I want to give you some real sort of key indicators of the health and functioning of our current system. But I hope that, and certainly as we continue these meetings, we'll get sort of a deeper dive on these specific issues. But I hope also that your questions following the presentation can get us to a greater level of sophistication and drive toward your specific interest areas. Because this system, if you take nothing else away, it's complex. It's complex and it's dynamic. And though there are things that unify the functioning of our system across our states from a federal perspective, there are a lot of areas where state differences matter. So we're going to look specifically here at Georgia, but in some respects, take a look at how Georgia compares with the rest of the country. To get us a little bit on the same page, first of all, this system, at least over the last decade plus a few years, has become increasingly outcome-oriented and performance-based. We have tons of measurements of this system. It is rigorously evaluated and done so at several levels. So we have a lot of outcome data, not all of which, of course, we're going to look at today. But I just want to make you aware of that. The large outcome areas for the child welfare system are in the areas of safety, permanency, and well-being. And we will kind of carve up our examination of the system along those broad dimensions today. Within those outcome areas, there are a tremendous number of competing policies, competing laws, competing interests, competing values, all of which, again, lend itself to the complexity of the work as we engage in any individual case with any individual family, and certainly as we look at the aggregate effects across the system. So with respect to safety, just for example, we have these competing tensions between the parental prerogative, right? We have a constitutionally protected right of parents to the care and custody and control of their children. That is where we start off fundamentally in the law with our federal constitution. So how do we honor that and still recognize that the state has a compelling interest in children's safety and that the state can intervene when there's a question about the child's safety? But that's where some of those tensions come when we see some of the stories and some of the cases that do hit the news, these questions about why didn't DFACS do more or no more. It has a lot to do with this really almost inviolate space around that parent-child relationship. But to be careful to know that it is not, in fact, inviolate, that the reason we're here is because the state has the authority to intervene. But how we do that and the measured way in which we do that is part of our charge to look at. And then where do children's rights stand in this at all? It's a much bigger question, far less rights articulated as a matter of a legal principle, but we have a number of statutes, both federal and state, that set out a whole array of complex laws that extend to children. And in any individual case, we're trying to decide the difference between a child's right to be placed with their sibling and their right to stay in the same school, or their right to a timely family and their right to be home with their own family. All of these kinds of things and so many more. With respect to permanency, for those children who do have to come into our foster care system because they cannot be maintained safely at home for the time being, and the state uses its power to intervene, we look at issues of permanency, which really mean how soon can we get that child back home safely? That's our first state prerogative. If that child cannot be reunited with their own family, how do we get them into another safe, permanent family as quickly as possible? Echoing back to the governor's very insightful comments, right? The system isn't about where we parent children. This is a place where we provide protection to children until we can get children in families, which is where children, as our value system, where children need to be raised. So tensions between reunifying children and finding them alternative families through the law, tensions between adoption as a most legally secure outcome and something short of adoption like a guardianship that may be more flexible and adaptable to an individual family and child circumstances, but provides slightly less legal security. What we do for that whole cohort of children who are going to age out of our foster care system, What are our expectations upon us and for them about how we get them to a place of self-sufficiency? So that when the state does raise children and the state is acting as their parent all the way through their legal adulthood at 18, what then is our obligation to them, and how do we prepare them to be self-sufficient adults? And we have this overarching preference for relatives, but we have some funny, complicated feelings about relatives. Sometimes we have these notions that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and yet we know that relatives also offer tremendous resources to children who can't be maintained with their biological parents. So how do we assess them? How do we give favor to relatives where we can? And how do we make those careful decisions? The well-being realm really has to do with health and education, with connections to family, including siblings, life skills as well for those children who are going to be aging out or who are older cohort of kids in our foster care system. So we have a whole range of obligations there that are slightly different from those more critical, perhaps, needs around safety and permanency. So that's the plate, and the plate's pretty full, and those things are driven by a number of things, and they're reprioritized by a lot of pressures that are external to the system itself. Those pressures include, and I'm sure this isn't exhaustive, right? Changes in state and federal law, the amount of resources that are allocated through the state and federal funding channels, high-profile cases, which we've seen lately, the cases of like Imani Moss and Eric Forbes. And what do they represent, and how do we react to that strategically and appropriately? What also don't they represent, which is important and part of our conversation here. Class action litigation, we have our own Kenny A consent decree that we're operating under that puts additional constraints and parameters around the work of some of our communities and county offices. Emerging best practices, right? This is an area of social science. Unlike some of the harder science fields, we don't know exactly all the time what interventions we can use with children and families to produce a given result. And yet we're learning a lot. And as we learn and know more, we do more and do better. And so those things continue to shape the work as well. Leadership changes in all of the agencies directly related to child welfare and peripheral to child welfare, and the changes in philosophies that come with those leadership changes. And also, and I think that this is an important one to note, and I think it's a little bit indicative, symptomatic of where we are now, and perhaps why we are literally here now, which is this kind of erosion in the public confidence in this system that comes from perhaps our inability or so far our lack of ability to really understand what it means when a high-profile case hits the news, and what is that narrative? And again, what does it say and what doesn't it say about the work that's getting done, and how do we account for those really difficult, tragic cases in a way that's responsible and responsive to those situations, and still understand how other work continues to be good and strong in some areas and reflect other deficiencies in other areas. So the erosion of public confidence, why can't we take pride in this system and restore the nobility to the workers who are doing this very difficult work, of which this is just one slide and a quick snapshot of all of those competing pressures and demands. Generally speaking, right, and you all, everyone in this room is knowledgeable enough to know how this rough flow chart, what this rough flow chart represents, but this is start to finish, and we're going to unpack the system a little bit in terms of its specific and discrete functions, but when we're thinking about how this process actually works, it begins with a call, right? At the first and foremost, one thing to understand about our child welfare system, perhaps despite what we'd like for it to be, as a matter of sort of community values, our system is reactive, it's responsive, it's set up that way. Someone has to first call and initiate the attention, bring a case, bring a child, bring a family to the attention of the department. It is not set up in most regards to be preventative, to be out there, and that has to do with that parental prerogative. We are not, as the state, allowed to be out there policing things and families unless there's an indication, a suggestion that something is wrong and that child's unsafe. So when we get that suggestion or indication, it comes by way of a call to the department. Most recently, we're in the process of transitioning to a statewide toll-free number, kind of a 1-800 number, so that you know what to call, so that there's some unification and easy identification of how to access this system. But that call from the community comes in, from the neighbor, from the grandmother, from the teacher, from the hospital, comes into DFACS. And you can see, and we'll talk more, there's a whole host of undetected child abuse in our communities. So now we're just focused here on the right side of what is detected, and it's about a quarter, roughly, of all the child abuse that's understood to be in the community actually comes to the attention of Child Protective Services, of the authorities who can intervene. When a case is reported, there is a decision made by that intake worker based on the severity of what's reported to them, based on the urgency of what's reported to them, what's going to happen next. Now, some cases aren't going to be, based on those allegations, aren't going to meet the definition of abuse or neglect. And so those will get screened out. One easy example, if you have a contested divorce case that's pretty messy, right? Sometimes those litigant parties will make calls to DFACS and throw allegations against each other, and those can be ferreted out pretty easily. That's going to be screened out as one example. For those cases that represent serious concerns of safety, they're going to be assigned to be investigated. And that's the course that most of us are most familiar with. That's the case when DFACS will assign an investigator who will go out within a set time frame, 24 hours to 5 days, lay eyes on the child, talk to the parents, talk to what they call collaterals, neighbors, teachers, other people who have information about that case, and determine through that investigation if there's credible evidence of child abuse or neglect, if they can uphold the allegations as they were reported. That's an investigation case. They're following the red arrows. For cases that are reported to them that there's some indication that there's a concern, a risk, something worth exploring further, but it doesn't give rise to a true safety threat that's immediate right now, we have an alternate course of response that's called family support in this state. And that's one area that's a relatively new area. I'm going to show you some data about that in a minute. We can talk further about that. But the idea here is that this practice originated as an alternative to that forensic investigation path, because the fact of the matter is the vast majority of cases of children of families who are reported to our department in Georgia as well as nationally are reported because of neglect. And there's a huge overlap between a neglect, the inability of a parent to meet a child's need, and poverty. And when those poverty cases don't really lend themselves to that forensic sort of investigation track in the same way, it doesn't sort of benefit any of us to determine who is the perpetrator of being poor. Do you see what I mean? So we come up with a different path that allows for the department to still go out, and this does lend itself to a little bit more of a flavor of prevention, but we're going out, we're looking at the family, we're doing an assessment, we're referring to them to community resources as appropriate for that family, and providing some follow-up and oversight. There's a little bit of a gentler intervention. Now, back to the investigation track. When that investigation goes out, I mentioned that based on the course of actions that are required by that worker, there is a determination about whether the evidence they're able to compile is sufficient to what we call substantiate the case. Again, make a finding that there is in fact abuse and neglect, that we've identified a victim, that those allegations can be upheld. A number of cases are unsubstantiated, where we deploy all of those state resources, we use all of that investigation power, and we go out to that family and do all this collection of information, and we aren't able to identify a victim, aren't able, in fact, to find enough evidence that abuse or neglect has occurred.